Chapter 6. When Eiji responded to the knock, he was surprised to find Lord Antony on the other side of the door. "My lord," he greeted, his mind whirling to make sense of the strangeness. What was his former master doing here? "Felix is dead," Lord Antony said. "You can't stay here." "Wait!" Fear shot through him, and an unexpectedly powerful pang of sadness. No more bed, no more master, no more duties, no more quiet greetings, no more steady dark eyes, no more "may I touch you." It was gone. It was all gone. It was over. They were in the kitchens now. "Do you want him?" Lord Antony asked. Zenji scowled at Eiji. Norio and Rokuro stood behind him, shaking their heads and curling their lips. "What use could we have for something like that?" Zenji spat. "Get him out of our sight!" Now they were in Lord Antony's rooms. Had they been here all along? Had Eiji ever really left? The only way the last few days made any kind of sense was if he had imagined them. "I could serve you again," he pleaded. "Please let me serve you again, my lord. I'll be so good. I didn't want you then. What would I do with you now?" Lord Antony wasn't sneering at him like the kitchen workers had. It was worse than that. The god wasn't even looking at him. His expression was mildly amused, but mostly bored, and it was the look Eiji had seen every day for 6 years, and it wasn't even directed at him, because Lord Antony never looked at him, never saw him, and he'd been stupid to think that Lord Felix would, or that it could possibly last, and now... A crash awakened him. Eiji kicked free of all the blankets and reeled out of his bed. Sweat stuck his thin nightshirt to his chest. His heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear anything, and he was still half asleep. But even so, there was a voice mumbling curses, and he was almost sure it was Lord Felix. Not dead at all! He stumbled through his curtains. Not dead! Of course Lord Felix wasn't dead, his mind told him as it dragged itself back to a sort of sluggish life. That was ridiculous. The gods could be killed, of course, but it happened very rarely. There had been around 100 gods when they first revealed themselves to the Taishans, and 1,000 years later they had lost perhaps a dozen of their number. This in spite of their battles with the monsters. Moreover, Lord Felix was a distinguished war god. If any divinities were to fall tonight, in a battle against mere humans no less, it was unlikely to be him. It had all been a dream. Just a stupid nightmare, but already he had clattered through Lord Felix's door and into the god's washroom in pursuit of the grumbling voice. Lord Felix was sprawled against the wall, stark naked and dripping wet. His armor lay in untidy heaps around him. Perhaps the crash had come from his body hitting the floor, or perhaps he had accidentally kicked a piece of armor. Either way, he looked up when he saw Eiji standing in the doorway. The god's eyes went wide, and he jerked himself to his feet, pressing his bare back against the wall. You're not supposed to be here," he slurred. His usually quiet voice was almost a shout. Oh gods. Oh no. Oh fuck. The last shreds of sleep cleared from Eiji's mind. His orders. He'd been given orders, stern and clear ones. He'd been told to stay in his room, and Lord Felix had even been generous enough to explain why, and he had still... Should he run back behind his curtain? It was too late to cover up his disobedience, but perhaps he could at least delay his punishment until Lord Felix was more himself. No, he'd always heard that quick movements were dangerous after a battle, running more than most. It would only inflame his master's predatory instincts. There was only one choice. Eiji dropped to the floor and curled himself into the tightest, smallest bow he could manage. "Forgive me," he gasped. He was still too addled with sleep and terror to waste any time fishing for the right words. For deliberate disobedience after a battle, there were no right words. "I didn't mean to disobey you. I'm sorry. Please don't hurt me." "Oh, no!" Lord Felix's voice was still loud, and now it sounded horrified. "Oh, sweet Eiji, no! No! I'm not going to hurt you, dear. I'm stupid right now, but I would never!" Eiji stayed still. The words were too strange to parse, too gentle and full of endearments. He couldn't trust them. He had to trust his instincts, which told him that at the moment he was a frog under the eye of a heron, and he had to hold still. There were clumsy, stumbling steps, a clatter, a muttered curse that brought tears of pure terror to Eddie's eyes, and then a resounding thud inches from his head. Lord Felix was there. He was right there, and any moment his hands or feet would descend and Eddie's punishment would begin, and Eddie knew with a sick twist of his guts that he would not survive that punishment. "Eddie, may I touch you?" The words were heavy and slurred. Touch sounded like tash. Still, the request was already so familiar as to be unmistakable. What kind of cruelty was this? Was he really going to be forced to consent to what was about to happen? Wasn't it enough that he would submit unquestioningly to his punishment? Why did Lord Felix want him to allow it, too? Never mind. It didn't matter why. He didn't deserve to know. If it was consent his master demanded of him, then consent he would give. "Yes, my lord," he whispered, then, unable to help himself, "Please have mercy!" When it came, the touch was so careful that it went all the way into being clumsy again. Lord Felix set his hands at Eddie's shoulders, but kept his fingers stiff as sticks rather than gripping the flesh. He tugged up and immediately lost his grip, jerking his hands away empty. Still, Eddie understood the gesture. He had never been so reluctant to rise to his knees in his life. Being in his proper position felt not safe, not at the moment, but safer than exposing his face and throat and vital organs to the god's discipline. Moreover, he was crying the way he taught himself, quiet and steady so that it made no noise, but there was no way to hide the tears once his face was lifted from the floor. He kept his eyes lowered. This showed him that Lord Felix was still completely naked as he knelt in front of Eiji. Once Eiji was rising, the god pulled his hands back and stuffed them into the soft creases behind his own knees, as if to ensure that he wouldn't move them by accident. "I'm not going to hurt you," Lord Felix said again. "Never, sweet Eiji, never, never. Why did you leave your room?" "Your unworthy slave had a nightmare, my lord." It was so hard to speak between the trembling of his lips and the tears of fear streaking his face. "The crash woke me and I was moving before I even knew what I was. Please forgive me, my lord, please, please. I'm so sorry. I will never disobey you again." He knew he should request his punishment, but self-preservation kept the words from his mouth. If he lived through this encounter, he would plead in all sincerity to be punished as his disobedience deserved. But right now, he could only focus on surviving the next moment. Requesting discipline from a god in this state would not help him in that endeavor. Pleading for mercy just might. It's all right." Halfway through the sentence, Lord Felix seemed to realize how loudly he was speaking. He dropped his voice to an exaggerated whisper. "You're not in trouble. You're good, so good. Sweet, sweet Eiji. Not in trouble." Eiji tensed further. There was no way that was true. It could only be a trick. Where was this leading? "You don't believe me." Now the god sounded almost petulant, though he knew it was blasphemy even to think that. "Look at me, sweet, then you'll see." An order was an order, even when it was delivered in a slow sing-song that raised every hair on Eji's body. He lifted his eyes to his master's face. Lord Felix's pupils were blown enormously wide, and his eyes were a little wild, but he kept them steady on Eiji. Overall, he did seem calmer and more earnest than Eiji had expected, and not at all angry. "See," his master crooned. "You're safe with me, dear. Wouldn't hurt you. Good night." The god tried to get up, seeming to forget the way he had imprisoned his hands. Instead of rising, he fell flat against the floor. Eiji cringed as Lord Felix's face hit the boards with a loud crack. "Oops," the god drawled against the floor. Then he started laughing, and he kept laughing as he dragged himself to his feet and swayed the 2 steps back to the basin where he'd been washing. Eiji stayed crouched in his place on the floor, unsure whether he'd been dismissed or not. In the meantime, he worked to stop the flow of his tears. There was no reason for them. He needed to calm down. He tried to distract himself from the still thrumming panic that clamored in his belly by watching Lord Felix at his ablutions. The god seemed to have cleaned himself all over by the time Eiji had arrived, but he was still scrubbing diligently at his fingernails. Eiji began to wonder if he would tear the tender skin beneath them. Not that there was much that seemed soft about Lord Felix's naked body. He was all tight muscle, from his wide calves to the broad shoulders that Eiji had fantasized about clinging onto more than once. The god's burly arms worked as he scrubbed, and Eiji couldn't resist letting his eyes travel down their length, all the way to large, busy hands. How had he never noticed the size of those hands when they brushed his cheek or smoothed his hair? His gaze roamed further over the expanse of damp skin. His master's back was broad and unmarred. Eiji was so close that he could see the individual little hairs that littered the dark flesh. Lord Felix started singing to himself in that strange language that did nothing to soften the atonal goose-like honk of his singing voice. Eiji's fear subsided, just a little. After a few more minutes of vigorous scrubbing and unfortunate singing, Lord Felix turned around. "Oh, Eiji!" He sounded surprised to see him, as though he'd forgotten him entirely. Not just surprised, though. Maybe pleased? It was hard to sort out tones when the god's turning had brought Eiji face to face with his cock. His very erect cock. Eiji wasn't sure whether this was a new development or whether he'd simply been too distracted with terror to notice before. His focus had been fixed on Lord Felix's hands, not his crotch. He was certainly focused there now. His master's cock was long and a little bent. The sight of it sent a hot, undefined jolt through Eiji's whole body. Excitement? Fear? He didn't have time to try to sort that out. This was his chance to redeem himself and finally be of some real service. "Eiji?" Heart thudding wildly at his own daring, he straightened his knees until his face was level with the god's crotch. His whole face was tight and thrumming with mingled fear and desire. It was all so terribly daunting, but what other gesture would do so much to show his gratitude for the mercy he'd received that night? There was nothing for it but to seek permission, and then to lean in and show his God how reverently, how eagerly he could worship. Maybe he'd forgotten all his lessons, but surely sheer devotion would count for something. He parted his lips in offering and gazed up at his master. "Please, my lord," Eiji breathed. "I would be so grateful if... Please use your servant, my lord. I beg you to use my mouth for your pleasure." "All right," Lord Felix slurred. "That's so kind. Thank you, sweet, sweet Eiji." Permission. But just as Eiji was about to dive forward, his goal slipped away from him. The god clambered unsteadily to his knees so that they were level with one another. Then Lord Felix's hands rose and cupped Eiji's face with excruciating care, and he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to Eiji's still-parted lips. It was so soft it barely seemed like a kiss, like anything at all. The god's lips were chilly, but he brushed them so gently over Eiji's that he barely even felt the cold. Eiji's own lips were still submissively parted, but Lord Felix's kiss was chaste. He only pressed one kiss to Eiji's upper lip and then one to his lower with a tenderness that seemed, incredibly, almost reverent. Then he pulled back and smiled at Eiji with such glowing delight that Eiji almost forgot to be confused. Lord Felix stroked his thumbs clumsily over Eiji's cheeks. "Thank you," the god breathed. "That was just as wonderful as I thought it would be." "My lord?" Eiji faltered. Lord Felix gave a little sigh, and Eiji wasn't sure whether it sounded sad or pleased. "Now I know this is real. If I were fantasizing, sweet dear, you would have said my name." "My lord, Eiji was so confused he hardly knew what to think, let alone say. There was only one thing that he was quite sure of. It began and ended the list. His master had wished for a kiss, for some inscrutable reason, and Eiji had been too dumbfounded to offer a proper one. "Please, my lord, I can do better," Eiji said desperately. "I was unprepared for your kind attentions, but if you just give me another chance, I can..." Easy, dear. The god tucked a stray strand of hair behind Edgy's ear and leaned in again, this time to press a chilly kiss to his forehead. I'm not safe tonight, I'm afraid. I'm a clumsy me. No, no, no. We'll go to bed and talk about it later. To bed, my lord? I'll go to my bed and you to yours, Edgy, with the sweet, sweet kisses. Go on now. Edgy obeyed and returned to his bed more bewildered than he had left it. What in the world was that?